Capacity is not efficiency. And I want to stress that, because if you look up here at this road, I've known project managers who'd look at this road and go, oh, there's 20 feet. I can get another car in there, right? But when we're running at 100% capacity on a freeway, we're stopped, bumper to bumper. We got 100% capacity, but we're not going anywhere. We've got a problem with flow. And we measure things in organizations somewhat dysfunctionally as well. And I'm going to talk about a place I was just at doing an assessment of a location, an organization, and they take their developers and they give them cards to scan in when they get to work, scan out when they go to lunch, scan in when they come back from lunch. And they're measured on being in turnstile 40 hours a week. Why? Well, because they figure they got 45 weeks out of the year that they need to be working. And they've got 500 employees. So this is how they do capacity management. We have 900,000 hours that we can divide up into projects. So at the end of the fiscal year, a few months before, they estimate all of the projects the business wants to do. They stack rank them, and they start off with large chunks. You know, this is 150,000 hours. This one's 200,000 hours. And they add it up until they get to the 900,000 hours. The fiscal year starts, and they all begin work. Is this efficient? Thoughts? We're measuring something, and I suppose it depends on how you define efficiency. I don't think it's efficient at all. In fact, I found a great quote. One of the guys in one of the interviews said this: our organization is structured to get 100% utilization, not 100% productivity. I think that kind of says it all. That's kind of the theme that I want to paint. I'm going to talk about a few things: push versus pull in software development, how we should be pulling things through and how that can help our flow and utilization. I'm going to talk a little bit about push versus pull in manufacturing versus software development. Then I'm going to go talk about Kanban. Not to the exclusion of Scrum or any of the other methodologies, but I think it's important that we talk a little bit about it. Organizational change is the foundation of this talk, and that's where we talk about pulling organizational change and why you may choose to do that instead of trying to push a change initiative through your company. Last, we've got some to-dos. These are things you can take away today. So as a moment of introduction, my name is Stephen Borg. I'm from Northwest Cadence. I'm founder of Northwest Cadence. You can reach me here via email. If you want a response on Twitter, you can tweet me there. And let's get started. First, push versus pull. And this is a concept that people have a lot of difficulty grabbing sometimes, but it's not too complicated. Here's an example from the Toyota Production System book. It's one of their guidebooks from the 60s. You'll notice push, they've got all of their paper clips together, and they jumble, right? You can't push a stack of paper clips. You can pull it through, however, and you get a much ordered flow through the system. And we're going to come back and talk more about flow. You may have heard it this way: you can't push a rope. And you can't. Quick definitions. In a pull system, work is generally accepted when there is capacity for the work. We want to pull it in so that we can work on it. In a push system, they have a characteristic that the work begins on a schedule. So we schedule the start date of the work, we work on it, and we schedule the end date. It may or may not hit it, but whatever the next start date is, we're going to start that piece as well. Another way of saying the same thing, believe it or not, is this. With pull, work is generally added until maximum flow is reached. With push, work is generally added until maximum capacity is reached. My job today is to persuade you, when you go back to your organizations, to shift your mindset to look at pull as opposed to push on several different levels. One of the things we can do now, let's jump into software development and manufacturing and talk a little bit about those two. Because pull really came from manufacturing. And we found the Toyota production system did a lot of that. Now, what you do in a traditional manufacturing approach, if you're not using lean, is you buy a very expensive ERP system. Or an MRP, a manufacturing planning, planning for resource planning for your manufacturing. And you buy that tool and you plug in all of your capabilities of all of your machines. And then you want to maximize your utilization of those machines because you paid a lot of money for those things. So this ERP system then calculates what types of things you're going to build so that each machine is maximally operational. So that it's always at 100% utilization. Or thereabouts, right, for maintenance, etc. Now, if you notice, manufacturing has some bits of variation. Even in manufacturing, you're going to find some variation, like in cars. Let's take a look at an example. General Motors, which has moved to a leaner approach lately, but has kind of stood as an example of a push system for a long time. Toyota, on the other hand, has done pull for 60, 70 years. The difference in 2008, I find this interesting, Toyota crossed over General Motors to be the largest car company in the world. And they did it with only 10% of the working inventory that GM had at its disposal. 10% of the working inventory. What does that mean? It means they can respond more quickly to change. They get faster feedback loops. And probably more importantly, they made a profit that year. And it was a hard year for car sales, where GM lost $5 billion. That's the difference between push and pull in manufacturing. Now, we're not manufacturing. Manufacturing, you've got limited variability. You don't really prioritize. One Toyota Camry is going to give you about the same amount of profit as the next one. Yeah, there may be some differences. But it's not enough to shift everything up. And reducing variability is almost always good. In software dev, on the other hand, we've got a radically different scenario. We have substantial variability. Right? Something that a feature may take a day to build, it might take 2 weeks to build, it may take 2 months to build. There's a large amount of variation that we have. In addition, prioritization is critical. And variation isn't always bad. I keep hearing this. I stood at the Scrum versus Kanban discussion yesterday at the open space. And I kept hearing this concept that variation is always bad. For those of you who want to, I won't dive into it here, but I'd love to talk with you afterwards. It's not. It's not always bad. And we shouldn't be spending a lot of useful cycles struggling against variation if there's something better we could be using that for. And that's a lot of cases. So we have a lot of variation in software. But one of the interesting things in software is we mimic what manufacturers do. They had those fancy ERP systems, and at Toyota they were replaced with Kanban cards. They're literally cards made out of kind of paper, basically. And when I'm working in a Toyota production line, that's how I signal that I've just used up my box of headlights. At the bottom of it, there's a card. I throw it over in a folder. Somebody walks by every now and then, picks up the folder, and brings me that many boxes of lights. We do the same thing in software. We have our big ERP systems, our big upfront plans that we've seen before in Waterfall, where you lay it all out in a Gantt chart. And the Agile movement has said, no. Let's look at a different lens. Let's look at it in a pull-based lens instead. So Agile is to our Waterfall as the ERP and push is to the Kanban pull systems. Let's talk about Kanban. Last night I put in a little bit more here because I think there's some misconceptions about Kanban as I was listening to it. I'm going to talk about some of the reasons for Kanban, and the first is WIP. What is WIP? Kanban focuses, and by Kanban now, I'm going to move to software development Kanban. It's the capital K Kanban. It's what we're now in the software arena where we're talking variability. WIP is work in process. It's how much stuff you're working on. Well, we have a problem in software development. In manufacturing, you know when you have WIP. you walk along the factory floor and you see a bunch of half-built cars sitting along waiting to be pulled through. You see big piles of inventory. But if you're in software development, you see approximately this. You got nothing. We don't see it. If you go ask somebody, hey, how much work in process do you have at your environment, your software team? How do you even measure that? Is it work that you're missing? Is it assignments? Is it tasks? Is it how many lines of code that you've written that are in dev and haven't been pushed into the test environment? What is it? And we don't know. Kanban seeks to address that by making WIP visible. The next thing Kanban looks at and focuses on are queues. And queues, basically, they're these stacks of things that you put behind people who are working so they don't run out of things to do. You give them a nice big queue, they won't run out of stuff to do before somebody else can put more stuff in their queue. The problem is that when we are looking at software development, we have a very poor intuition about what the impact of queues are to an organization. And I'm going to do an example, just so you can kind of see it for yourself. So work with me if you would. I've got these three gentlemen. I've got my product owner on the left, and I've got two people who need to process that piece of work, that thing off the stack. So what they're going to do is that yellow-hatted guy is going to grab a piece of work off. He's going to flip a coin, and if that coin comes up heads, he's done with his work. And that's round one, and he sets it down. It's an exercise. Now, next time, we have round two. There's that piece of work sitting there. Both of them pick up their piece of work. Both of them flip a coin. And we then, if it's heads, we move it on. If it's tails, we keep it. That's the variation that we're introducing. On average, it takes the yellow-hatted guy 2 rounds, let's call them days, 2 days to finish a piece of work. Because on average, heads and tails, right? It's 50% probability they finish. Same with the other guy. But what happens is that sometimes what the middle guy, let me go back one. What the middle guy has, what the middle guy has is a bunch of queues right there. There's a queue in the middle because the yellow guy hit it lucky. He's got a bunch of easy tasks and he's just slamming them in, getting them done. And a queue starts to build. So as we're working this system, we have queues. Now I want you to ask yourself, how long on average should it take to get an item from one side to the other side? On average. 2 days on average for the first guy, 2 days on average for the second guy. Add them up and include queue time, and how long should that take? On average, 14.6 days. It's not 4, because there's a bunch of queues that pile up. What's interesting is that even though the average size of the queue is 5.3 coins, when I ran this as a Monte Carlo simulation, the longest average time, not just the longest time in 2,000 runs, but the average time in any given run, the longest go was 72 days to get something across. You see this in software dev. What happens is you're cranking along, there's a high priority thing, things are getting slower and slower and slower, and now all of a sudden you have to build the high priority thing. And it takes much longer than you expected for it to get into production. The output was 92 coins. They were able to make it through. We're going to come back briefly. But those queues, we don't get a good idea of how bad queues are for us. I assumed no multitasking there. Let's talk about multitasking. When you have a large number of queues, you often end up having to multitask among them. Not just take the top one off and work on it, but because you've got 3 different projects, you got to show some progress on each of those projects. And this is where multitasking becomes a problem. Here is Clark and Wheelwright's. This is a very common thing. We've probably all seen it. The number of concurrent assigned tasks and the total amount of time that a person will spend on those tasks. This is the total. So you notice if you're down at 5 different tasks, your effectiveness as a knowledge worker is about 40%. So you're only giving about 8% of your effort to tasks. 60% of it is just wasted. It goes into the context switching arena. That's a lot of cost. How many of you work on 5 projects? More than 5. There's a chunk. How many of you work on less than 5? I just had to go with the binary question because not everyone raised their hand. I'm going to give an example from the real world. There's a team in the United States, there's 10 developers. And they're working on projects, 16 ranging to 20 some odd projects. And these projects are relatively short-lived, but they work on a lot of them simultaneously. And the culture of the company is such that they all work on those at the same time. So I have to report status on all of these. In fact, one woman on this team actually was in meetings 24 hours a week reporting status, and she was a developer. How much time does she have to dev? Not a lot. That's the multitasking, or context switching costs. So they asked, can we hire more people? And the company said, absolutely not. You're not delivering anything anyway. Why don't we? However, we did just sign this contract, and we have 2 offshore folks. We'd love to give you the offshore folks. Will you use them? Yes. So you got 2 developers from India. Now what happens is we've come in and we migrated them to TFS. And when we migrated them, we have all this data. And we looked at just overall lines of code written. I know, that's a horrible metric. And I don't encourage you to use it. But there's some correlation, no matter how tenuous, between lines of code and stuff delivered when you're working on the same types of projects in the same language with roughly the same skill sets. So I have to ask you, in 1 year, what percentage of the code was written by the people who didn't have to multitask? 80%? Who said 80%? That means they wrote 40% of the code each. That's pretty aggressive. Anyone go higher? Aw, come on. Somebody's got to go higher. 90! And you're the winner. 90% of the code. The people in India didn't have to multitask. When they first got the assignment, they said, here's 16 projects to work on. And they said, great, which one first? Well, all 16. We love it. We're going to work on all 16. Which one first? They're contractually obligated to not work on more. No consulting company in existence would take on 16 projects because it would be they'd fail and they'd get fired. Nobody's going to abuse their resources so badly unless they're going to be used internally. Then for some reason they get abused. I don't know what it is, but they're going to get abused internally. So those 2 people, and I've met them, they're not like super genius developers. They're kind of the same skill level. Each person there wrote 45% of the code. I'm going to get on a soapbox for a moment. Because your management, a lot of you, and that is not a developer productivity problem. That's a management problem. And management is stealing lives away from those developers who chose a career path and want to be good at what they do, and they're being restricted from fulfilling their potential. It causes an awful lot of problems. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox. But I wanted to be on there because you don't get to talk to leaders in the community like this often enough. So let's talk about Kanban. We've got work in process, we've got queues, we've got multitasking. We've got a few other things that we want to solve, cycle times, etc. But those are good enough to start. Now let's talk a little bit about Kanban. And this is your kind of the standard Kanban board looking thing. This is not waterfall. It may have analysis, dev, acceptance, prod. And I heard people chatting about that during the keynote. Oh, it's waterfall. It looks like waterfall. It's not. What we're doing is we're taking where we are right now and moving forward. So the first principle of Kanban, start where you are. Kanban is a tool to drive evolutionary change as opposed to driving big bang change. So we start and we say what we do today is we wait for stuff to be assigned to us. We put it through analysis, we put it through dev, we put it through acceptance, we put it through prod. That's first step in Kanban. Start where you are. Second step in Kanban, visualize your work. So you'll see we've got a bunch of these cards stacked up here. These are user stories, and there's a bunch of things at the bottom you can kind of ignore. But we're putting up what we're working on. What's interesting is when companies do that, or they execute the first queries out of TFS or whatever tool they're using, their usual response is, oh my goodness, I've got a ton of work in process, much more than I thought we had. It's not uncommon for people to have 80 to 100 tasks assigned to them that are active. Nobody pays attention to that many, but they're there, mucking up things. Now, once we've visualized it, the third step is we put a definition of done. What does it mean? We make our policies explicit. What does it mean to go from analysis into development? That's similar to Scrum, your definition of done. And the last step, the step that converts this board from push to pull, is we do one more thing. We establish a work in process limit. So if you look at development, I can only do 3 things in development. That's it. I can only have 3 things. You'll notice 2 are in ongoing, 1's in done. What if my developers push those 2 into done? They're done. Everything they're working on is done. What do those developers do in a Kanban team? Nothing. Exactly. They may sit on their tushes and twiddle their thumbs. They may play video games. Chances are they have some cross-functional skills. They're going to go help someone out. That's fine. But it's important they don't pull work ahead of time. This is why. Because if they went over and grabbed that analysis piece and brought it in, cranked through, now they're done with that one, they set it to the side, then they go get another one because the testers are blocked, the acceptance folks are blocked, pretty soon they've got this giant pile of work in process to get through. Now you start to have those problems of multitasking and everything else. So now I'm advocating people sitting around doing nothing on your payroll. They're getting recharged for the next task. That's the way to look at it, right? Getting ready for the next piece. Here's why it matters. We focus on utilization. General Motors, how much is this machine working? Because doggone it, I don't care if it's not the constraint. We're going to have it working 100% of the time, cranking out parts, even if we can't use those parts yet. Maybe someday we will. Toyota says, nah, if the machine has to sit idle, the machine sits idle. Even though they're very, very expensive machines. What that does is it provides a whole slew of benefits. And one of those benefits is that we now make work visible. I can see what's happening. And when I can see it, I can manage it. So all that work appears on this Kanban board. Electronic, not electronic. And the work being visible means, wow, I see too much. I'm going to solve a problem now. So what I have is I need to solve this issue. Work is visible. I've got too much stuff. Let me go fix it. How do I do that? I don't know. And Kanban's not going to tell you how to do it. You have to figure that piece out by yourself. I'll give you some hints in a moment. Here's the benefit. WIP limits reduce the queues. It ensures that we can't have big queues. And in doing so, it speeds our cycle time. Something called Little's Law. There's a relationship between cycle time and a queue, the work in process. And it just so happens that if the queue is short, the cycle time's short. As queues get longer, cycle time lengthens. It's only common sense, but we ignore it in software development a lot of times. Let's revisit. Remember we had our average size of the queue was 5.3 coins? Our WIP limit doesn't have to be huge. Let's put an average size queue, only 5, a WIP limit in the middle, and rerun simulation. And what do you get? You get a substantial improvement in your average throughput time, but most importantly, the longest time through the system drops from this unpredictable 72 days to a maximum of 14 days on average. That is a radical change. It introduces predictability into a system that may not have been predictable before. Now, if you saw Aaron Bjork's talk, you saw some really cool stuff where he organized Scrum. Limit WIP. This isn't just explicit or exclusive to Kanban. WIP is limited by things like Scrum as well. So we can limit WIP by Scrum. Now, if we take a look at the changes, we have 3 positive changes and 1 negative change. Remember, I am not assuming any multitasking costs here. I'm not going to talk about feedback cycles. You've heard about that all yesterday and most today, overall cycle time. But that's where you can get that reduction, or the benefits of it. The only penalty we had was, assuming no multitasking costs, our productivity dropped 4%. Now, are you willing to trade 4% reduction in the amount of stuff you deliver to have your delivery time? And I'll tell you what, most people who ship software focus so insanely tightly on the technical risk. Am I going to deliver on time? Are my teams effective? Am I on budget? And Steve McConnell looked at that and said, that's only 10% of the overall risk that you have as a company shipping a product. The 90% risk that you have is the market risk, that you're going to ship the wrong product. Cycle time handles market risk. We're looking at the wrong things when we look and worry about that 4%.
I have a question.
Yes, question.
I know you're saying productivity dropped by 4%, but I'm not sure if it is really true, because if there is a long queues all over top management are down, they're spending time trying to figure out the status.
Absolutely.
The expense, probably it is less expensive for this one.
So this was, I made no so the question is, I don't believe it. I bet they're more effective. Because if they had big queues, they've got a lot of status updates, etc. I made the assumption there is 0 cost to any of that. In practice, that team delivers substantially faster. We've seen it again and again. The team delivers much more quickly. So let's take a look at the positive feedback cycle you get by focusing on your work in process and pulling it through. Remember, pull is simply an indication that you have a limit to what some portion of your team can do. Lower WIP, smaller queues, faster flow, faster feedback. And now let's step back. Questions on Kanban before I go further? How is Kanban different from Scrum? It depends. Kanban starts always where you are at today. Scrum generally requires that you make a change to the way your organization works right away, before you can be considered Scrum. And we may hear some things tomorrow that maybe show some incremental changes to the way Scrum can be adopted. Looking forward to David's talk tomorrow, David Starr. Organizational, did that answer your question? It's a big topic. I probably won't answer the whole thing. Sometimes in Kanban, you don't have iterations. Sometimes you do. It's a different approach for process improvement. I'll maybe talk a little bit more when we get to what you should choose, Scrum or Kanban, if your organization is making that change. And a question down here. Yes?
In this context, how do we handle the problem when the developer or any person in the team pushes the work so long that it will affect the measures?
So the question is, what happens if you get something that the variation is so high that it just doesn't flow through the system? It gets stuck. It gets stuck in the system. This is one of the beauties of having a Kanban system in place with a limit, because that gets raised very, very rapidly to management. They can see it. It's stuck. And when you talk to folks using a Kanban board, they'll see that piece there, and they'll react to it. Scrum reacts to it in your stand-up. You might come back and say, yeah, I'm stuck. Come help. Kanban does it by that same thing, that stand-up most teams do, and they can look at it right there and see that it's stuck. You may swarm it. You may do a lot of different things to try to get it pushed through the system. Or you may pull it out and throw it away. Who knows? Could be too hard to write. If you pull in software, your teams will start to deliver substantially better. I can make that assertion without any hesitation. I've never seen it work the other way. The most popular pulling form today is by pulling through iterations. We commit to a specific chunk of work, we pull it in, and then we push the work through the system in a small iteration. So we don't have the big pushes. We have no chance of our WIP limit growing beyond the size of that iteration. Now, organizational change is very, very difficult. How many of you have tried to adopt Scrum and failed? How many of you have tried to adopt Lean Six Sigma and failed? None. How many of you have tried to adopt some other process improvement tool and failed? Just a few. What one, if you don't mind my asking? Just tried to do general agile and it failed. Sometimes you have to have that break from the past. Your team can't even deliver the simplest code. You got to just break from the past and start something new. But other times your team is delivering, but you don't want to throw everything out and start with something new. You want to start where you are and change. And I'm going to give you an example of an organization that made this change and how they did it incrementally. By the way, these are the three things that I believe stop you from making an organizational-wide change. The first is high work in process. Everybody is so busy putting out fires, doing this, doing that, running around frantically doing their tasks, that they're unable to allocate any time or any thought to change. As WIP is reduced, that pressure comes off a little bit because they're not doing so much multitasking, and they can now focus on doing some of the organizational change piece. It's ironic. The organizational change is what's going to bring the reduction in WIP. You're in a catch-22. So you need to get that high work in process down. The other is lack of clear prioritization. Frankly, I'm shocked, but businesses have a very, very difficult time prioritizing what they want to deliver. You might see it if you have Pri 1, 2, and 3, and everything's Pri 1, right? Go build all this stuff. It's really hard for them to say, build this first, then build this, then build this. And why it's so hard for business is because they're not focused so narrowly on one product. They're looking at a portfolio. They're balancing all sorts of competing needs in the marketplace. It is difficult for them to prioritize. But until they can effectively prioritize, organizational change is difficult. And lack of trust is the last one that blocks. And you'll hear it. Well, what if I don't tell my developers what to do? They'll just play video games all day. Has that ever been anyone's experience? Oh. Shout it out.
No, I mean, that just actually happens.
Okay.
Management isn't, discipline wasn't there.
Discipline wasn't there. The discipline wasn't there to drive it. Maybe there wasn't oversight enough to see what was see what was happening. It's rare for me, in my experience, to see teams not just grab a hold and run once they're freed from the constraints of the push system where they're massively overloaded. Those teams tend to do good things. I'm going to come back. I want to mention one more thing on that, because I think a lot of times developers or people in general hit a form of paralysis when they're overworked. I know this is a difficulty I have. If I have 15, 20, 30 different competing things, it's really hard to figure out and focus and do one of them. I got so many crazy things. I don't know which is priority. I don't know which to do. But boy, if I just checked my email, that's something I can do now. I can update my Facebook. There are things, and maybe there's a sense of that with an overwhelming piece. I don't know. But here's an example. Now, this company builds small things, portlets basically. These little portlet applications that sit on a portal, web parts. And if you notice, they've got a lot of stages they flow through. I'm going to walk you through these stages. To-do, stuff they've got to start working on. Design. And then they go into this really interesting phase. Design sign-off. And unfortunately, sign-off is not done by the team. It's done by someone 2 levels higher in the hierarchy. This is our first problem. that we're having in an organization. Because we can change the Scrum team or the team, but how do we change people 2 levels higher? Coding queue, we go into coding. We then go into coding sign-off. At coding sign-off, we have that same sort of someone who's looking and saying, I can't let you pass this gate. This you'll notice is waterfall, right? Build a bunch of stuff, have a nice big long queue in coding sign-off until everything's done, and then bulk shove it into the next system. Move it across, testing sign-off, going into a queue, deployment queue, and done. This visualization, by the way, is courtesy of Visual Whip. It's a tool on CodePlex by Håkon Force. Absolutely love it. It lets you visualize your work in process from TFS. Just ties in and very easy to use. Now, here's what happens when these people hold a meeting. The design sign-off folks get together, and what do? They dump everything that was in this queue that the team had no control of, and plop. They drop it into the team's lap. If you look up there, look at how much stuff they've got. They now have this massive overload of work. And all the emails go out that says, hey, to the stakeholders, good news. You've made it past the stage gate. The developers are now working on it. And what happens? That interrupt cycle begins. People are calling saying, great news, I heard you're working on it. When's it done? I have no idea. It's in my queue. It's very difficult. They went from a work in process, they constantly go from working on 19, 15 things to now working on 30, 40, 50 things. And that whipsawing is incredibly hard on the team. They moved to Scrum as their first attempt. And that's their first burn down chart. That is the most beautiful burn down. For a first iteration, I have never seen anything like it. Absolutely gorgeous. But when you look deeper, you found out they weren't doing Scrum at all. Scrum requires or recommends or demands or encourages that you have something to show at the end of your iteration. What they were doing, because they couldn't get through the design people, they'd say, oh, in this sprint we're going to do all the design work. Try to get the approval. Now we'll do all the coding. Now we'll do all the tests. It looks brilliant, but they're not solving any of their problems. So it's back to the drawing board. And here's an interesting thing. You don't have to change the organization, the job titles, what states people go through, what people even do, if you think through a little bit and look at people's incentives. All you had to do is add one column. We had an ROI for each of these things flowing through. Very formal company. If you don't have an ROI, it doesn't get approved. If we have a return on investment calculation, we can calculate the value per week, per day, to the company to have those things flowing through. So then you just stick this up here on your visualization. Spend a few $1,000 and you get this mounted on the wall so people can see it. And what happens when the manager of that design sign-off walks by? He looks up. What's this? Oh, it's nothing. Don't worry about it. We're just trying to track how much it costs for things to hang out in states, how much it costs the company. But we know you're really busy, so don't worry about it. That does not take long before he learns that I don't want my boss walking by and seeing this is how much I'm costing the company by not signing off. And what was the result? This is the result. And where I want to stress this is organizational change. This is a simple example. They have a lot more work to do. But organizational change doesn't have to demand that everybody change what they're doing. In this case, nobody changed anything from what they did except visualize the work, think a little bit about incentives for people, and put up a little thing that says this is how much stuff is costing. No job titles changed. Developers didn't learn anything to do anything new. They started here and were able to make a change. And when you look at what that change accomplished, we now have work in process across there that is dramatically smaller. What does that mean? They ship much, much faster. What this means in practice is this team starts caring about ROI and trumpeting the fact that they're giving this much value to the company, which before they'd never do that because it took them too long to deliver. That's the power of incremental change. Now, do you always have to do incremental change? No. Right. Here's just an example. If this is just pulled from their tasks. So you'll see tasks, when they used to start a task, move it to active, before they'd move it to done, they would work for, it would be approximately 51.6 hours. And they worked on that task only 4.37. This is your touch time versus lead time. Or touch time versus queue time. And it was sitting around just waiting for stuff to happen. If you look what happened in the case from January to May, you'll see now they're focused much more on getting things done. They start a task, finish the task before they move on. Working about the same on the task, 20, 30% reduction in the amount of effort on the task, probably from reduced multitasking, that kind of stuff. But what the big number is this hours of throughput drops dramatically. In practice, that means that team can shift directions and aim at what the business is trying to solve much more readily than we can before. There's only one here. This is just another report pulled out of TFS. And this is bug count target. Our target between January to April, down 38% in the number of bugs released per, the items, per month in there. Pretty dramatic reduction in the number of bugs released. So it's not just cycle time that's improved. Bug counts improved. All these other things have improved. There's a scale of pull to push. And on one side, you have waterfall, which says do everything in design, pass it through a design review before you even start doing coding. That's the ultimate in push. We move up, RUP and iterative, who knows where they stand. Scrum and Kanban tend to sit up towards the top, which is why they seem to have such good success. Now, Scrum doesn't do pull all the way through, unless you're doing Scrumban or something internal. But inside the sprint, Scrum just demands that you pull off the backlog, then you can push through if you want, and then you pull off the backlog again. Kanban goes one step further and says we're going to pull all the way across. Don't think, however, that I'm telling you you should abandon what you're doing with Scrum and go to Kanban because it pulls further. There's reason to push. One person in the audience here, I know, has moved to an iteration-less Kanban, and now they're missing the iterations. They miss the celebrations, they miss the time pressure, they miss that time box. So they're going back to an iteration model very similar to Scrum. But that's kind of that spectrum that you're going to get. Any questions? Trying to keep it nice and tight. Nino, did you see someone? Before I get to to-dos. All right. Not a soul. Oh, we got one. We got one. Thanks.
Sports for me. You again, right? Me again. Yeah. Any suggestions on running 5 sprint teams and having that all flow down to a release manager, one release manager to get out the door to production? So you've got those cycles going, and effectively at some point you hit 2 or 3 trying to end at the same time, and then that just expands what that release process takes.
Sure.
Any suggestions on that?
Did everyone hear that? You've got a lot of Scrum teams are pushing together, and they're going to dump in one big go, boom, onto the release manager. That is, it can definitely be an issue, right? I mean, it's a major one. A lot of that integration, and I might connect you up with Martin Hinchelwood. He does a lot of the Scrum work at Northwest Cadence to answer some of that. But the idea is you're probably going to have to pull a lot of that integration work into your actual sprint cycle so that you're not dumping as much onto that guy, that integration manager. Question?
All right. You mentioned that if you, with true Kanban, when you're basically done with your work, you don't pull because you don't want to create a queue. At what point would you know to actually, you do need to pull? Does that make sense?
Sure. So I may make sure I understand the question. If once the folks on the far right-hand side, once they had pulled into production, then their WIP limit of 2, they only have 1 item in there, so they'll automatically draw something from dev, and that gives dev the ability to pull from analysis. And then analysis can reach into to-do and pull the next thing. So it's pull from right to left is where the pull goes in a Kanban experience. Let's just talk some to-dos, because there's some things that you can do right away. And the first is accept. Accept where you are today. Before you're looking, you're going to come back from this conference fired up with all these changes. And if you go back and say, everything we're doing is wrong, let's scrap it and start again, you may encounter resistance. Understand your current process. It didn't get there because people were these evil things trying to create something to mess everybody up. Right? It evolved over time in response to business needs that may now be gone, but they've left that process in place. Understand the process first. This is respect the people. They're not the process. If your process is really messed up, that's not the people's fault. That's not the dev's fault. They're in that environment where they're doing that development. Respect those individuals. And I mean, don't go in and tell them, everything you're doing is wrong. Right? Understand, respect, and then start to make some of those adjustments. The next thing is shift your mind a little bit. Go from something, look for flow, not utilization. The guy on the left is working an awful lot harder. His utilization is much, much higher than the guy on the right. But as a business, do you really care? No. The utilization isn't what matters, it's what's being delivered. I love this quote from Jim Benson. Capacity is how much stuff will fit. Throughput is how much stuff will flow. They're not synonymous. So the point, as an example, we treat people as though they're these containers. They're this bottle. And they've got a calendar that we can fill up with 80 hours of meetings every 2 weeks. Or 80 hours of things, and we pile it all in. And we force them into this. But work is not water. Work flows. Humans process work. They don't run it through. So as an example, if you're looking at this and you're looking at flow, and I've got this neck, is it the capacity of the neck that I want to maximize? Or do I want to hit laminar flow? If you tilt over a bottle, it'll come out slightly this way. If you tip it this way, less comes out. You actually get lower flow when you tip something upside down directly. You've probably all done that experiment with your kids at home. No? No? You can empty it a lot faster by tipping it and just letting it go. You don't have to turn it over and dump it. In fact, the gurgling and stuff, it's called laminar flow. You don't hit it, and it comes out much slower. So let's talk a little bit more then about what you can do when you go back. Visualize your work in process. And the reason you visualize it is because you're not the only person there. You may know about WIP and you're going to watch it and understand it, but the problem is there are other people at your organization that are managing things. And if a manager can't manage what they want to manage, they will very often manage what they can measure. And your time card, they can measure. It's there, it's available. The throughput's harder. The WIP limit's much harder. So make sure that that visual is available. This is a big one, folks. It's the biggest recommendation I can give you is to look for cues in your organization and get them out. Understand where they are, reduce them to the appropriate size. On Friday, we'll talk about what the appropriate size is. Right? But get them down to a size that's manageable, that you get throughput, but you can still handle variation. They're directly related to cycle time. Reducing your queues will speed your cycle time. And this is because they're a leading indicator. They let you know where you are today, and they lead your cycle time. If you wait and use yesterday's weather to predict how far you're going to deliver, if things are going off the rails, you don't know about it until they're well off the rails, if you're measuring cycle time. If you measure queues, you know right away. It's a leading indicator. That's why queues are so important to measure. And again, lowering your WIP gives you smaller queues, faster flow, faster feedback. It's a virtuous cycle, right? You can get into that virtuous cycle piece. And the last is evolve. If you're going to do an incremental change, evolve. How do you know what to change? If your organization has implemented Scrum, you have a blueprint. You must do this, you must do this, you must do this. Follow that blueprint. If you're doing pure Kanban, you're looking for those opportunities that are the most impactful opportunities that aren't the biggest change. You're looking for places, root causes that you can make small changes to hit behaviors. Plan, do, check, act, that's a common one. Observe, orient, decide, act, the OODA loop, that's another one. And if you happen to be a Lean Six Sigma shop, you'll use DMAIC, design, measure, analyze, improve, control. I don't care what you use. I like plan, do, check, act. But decide what you're going to do, measure it for a bit, make the change. Did you improve? If you didn't, you might have made the wrong change. Roll it back, try something different. And make that incremental change and continue to evolve your company, your organization. Before I take questions, I want to hit one last thing. There's kind of a spectrum. On one side, you have the extremely competent Agile folks. On the other side, you have teams that have never heard of Agile. If you're on this side of the never heard of Agile, Kanban is probably not an appropriate choice. Because you'll put it up, you'll visualize what you have, and then you're stuck because you don't have the principles behind it. You don't understand why you should change. No one gets the limited WIP stuff. No one gets the pull. That side, you probably are going to want to stick with something that's more prescriptive. Extreme programming, Scrum, one of the more prescriptive guidances. As you move along, you can still choose Scrum along a lot of this, but at some point you can say, if we've got some pretty good Agile folks, we can make that continuous change, so you can start using either Scrum or Kanban, flowing it across that way. And as you get towards the end with the extreme Agile, if you guys are, you're doing extreme programming and you guys are just cranking away and everybody's brilliant at it, chances are you're not going to throw it out and try something that's a whole different process or a whole different framework. You may just put something on top of it like Kanban, which can help you then drive improvement. Start with where you are, drive improvement from there. Questions?
I have one, Steve.
Yes,
May I ask something? Actually, if I'm a Scrum team or new to Scrum, would it make sense to look at Kanban like for organizing the sprint itself? Would it be a great fit, actually, to try them both if I'm going that route?
It could very well be. So if you're a new Scrum team, you may want to also look at Kanban inside of your sprints for running through. So you can visualize the work so that everybody doesn't start all the user stories, then get halfway through the sprint and go, uh-oh, which one do we cut? Start at the kind of focus on delivering. And another way you use Kanban is you go one step higher in the organization. You're flowing right now inside user stories, inside sprints. But those might be broken down into epics, which you want to flow in a Kanban board for the business to see, the epics flowing across. That's another good utilization for that.
Sounds very good, like a good recommendation, yeah.
Good.
So thank you. So we're out of time. So thanks, Stephen.
Thank you very much, folks.